Recently, Warner Bros. Came under heavy fire from consumers because it was announced that the film Coyote vs. Acme, a combined live-action and animated comedy featuring Wile E. Coyote, Will Arnett, and John Cena, was going to be unceremoniously locked in the WB vault despite being totally finished. Reason being, the bean counters over at WB decided that the movie was unlikely to break even, and thus the suits at the top made the call to trash it so it can be deemed a tax write-off. Obviously, this seems like a complete and utter waste of effort, especially the effort of people involved in its creation who might have been hopeful of the film's release. It's also wasteful of the anticipation of Looney Tunes fans. No matter how you slice it, it just comes off as ruthlessly pragmatic corporate penny pinching. And what really makes this confusing is that, apparently, test screenings of the film had very positive reactions. Combining that with the sheer power of the Looney Tunes name, it seems doubtful the movie would be that much of a bomb, if one at all. Thankfully, the public backlash to this decision has led to WB instead shopping around for other distributors to sell the movie to. Worst of all, this isn't even the first time this happened. Warner Bros. Also apathetically tossed away Batgirl, which was also completely finished, and Scooby-Doo and the Haunted High-Rise. Is it possible these films would have indeed failed to break even? Sure, but that doesn't change how ridiculously inefficient this makes WB look. Even if it was a smart call financially, they shouldn't have let themselves reach the point where they were canceling fully completed movies in the first place. And that's not even addressing the sheer fact that, as consumers, none of us have to be sympathetic to the finances of a corporation that saw $34 billion in revenue in 2022. But that's starting to get off topic a bit. The reason I bring this all up is because it got me thinking. Why are companies allowed to basically discard their work or pretend it isn't theirs, while also locking it out of reach from consumers? That seems like the result that negatively affects the most people. Even in the case of WB, where they might get a reimbursement for these movies in the form of a tax write-off, that doesn't change the fact that time and manpower were put into the film to begin with. Time and manpower that could have gone to a project that got an official release. That's tens or even hundreds of thousands of total work hours they get to pretend never happened. If they want to throw it all away, then they might as well toss it to the public where the final product can at least have a chance to reach the eyes and ears of people who might appreciate it. This situation reminded me of something else. The history of video games and software in general, and how it's rife with projects that are also tossed away. And they are aptly called Abandonware. Granted, Abandonware isn't the exact same as the Coyote vs. Acme situation. Abandonware is typically released officially before slowly losing revenue and ultimately being ignored by its publisher or owner. I've talked about Abandonware before, dating all the way back to my 3-year-old video on the importance of piracy. But for the sake of convenience, I'll go over it again here, since it is the main topic of the video. Publishers and copyright owners no longer care about their abandoned product because it's no longer making them any money. And why aren't these games making any money? Well, there's no physical copies being printed to put on store shelves anymore, and they have not been ported to modern platforms, so no current-day digital storefront even sells them. Not Steam, not GOG, not PlayStation Store, Xbox Live, or Nintendo eShop. They're nowhere. If you want them, your only choices are buying a second-hand copy, which may be more expensive than you think thanks to the terrible used game economy and how insanely overpriced some classics are, or piracy. That's it. You might think that there's not that many abandoned games. After all, the medium has only existed for about 50 years. So how many are there? 5,000? 10,000? Maybe even 15,000? Well, according to the homepage of myabandonware.com, a site dedicated to hosting abandoned games between 1977 and 2012, there's over 26,000 games tossed aside by publishers. And before you make any assumptions, not all of these games are no-name titles. The library of deserted works includes stuff like Need for Speed 2, Underground 2, Hot Pursuit 2, and the original Most Wanted. It also has Silent Hill 2, Silent Hill 3, and Silent Hill 4, Oregon Trail, Black and White, Civilization, The Incredible Machine, House of the Dead, Typing of the Dead, MechWarrior 4, Zoo Tycoon, Command and Conquer, Manhunt 2, and even several Yu-Gi-Oh games. These are not random shovelware garbage. Some of them were huge hits from a decade ago or more. Now, because these games are abandonware, they are relatively safe to redistribute publicly like they are through myabandonware.com. That much is certain, and it's definitely one upside to the situation. Unfortunately, in a lot of cases, that's the most you can get away with. The fact that these games are considered abandoned doesn't give everyone free rein to just do what they please with them. You see, there are several types or circumstances of abandonware, and some of them are very easy to work with and have minimal risk of intervention by an owner. For example, freeware or open source programs or code that has been abandoned, or orphaned code whose owner is extremely difficult, if not impossible, to identify or contact, or programs that were owned by a company that no longer exists. In these situations, abandonware can be shared pretty openly, and it's highly unlikely anyone will make any effort to stop it. In fact, you could even go so far as to modify it and maybe even remake it with the same name and everything, and you might still be left alone. However, there are other types of abandonware that do carry some or even significant risk, especially if you try to actively redistribute the software. Specifically, games that are owned by a company that still does exist, but they simply ended support and turn the other cheek away from those who share. They don't condone it, but they don't try to stop it either, because it's just not worth the effort. But the fact of the matter is, they can stop it whenever they wish. This is where a huge chunk of video game abandonware sits, especially the popular titles I listed earlier, and it's why no one really tries to redistribute the games in a more official or robust capacity. If they attempt it, the company who owns the IP might suddenly step in and throw their weight around, even though they didn't care about the product until now. It's very frustrating, and it keeps these old classics locked to a level of obscurity they don't deserve to be confined to. This is where the public domain would help. For anyone who has heard the term before but isn't exactly sure what it is, I'll give a brief rundown. The public domain is the total collection of all creative works that are no longer under the protection of exclusive intellectual property rights. These rights could have either expired, been willfully given up, waived by some sort of contract, or just otherwise rendered no longer applicable. For example, the works of Leonardo da Vinci are all in the public domain because he was long dead before copyright even became a thing. And more recently, Winnie the Pooh entered the public domain simply because copyright on the character expired. It's why that terrible horror movie was allowed to release. Basically, when something enters the public domain, anyone can use it for anything, including monetizing it. It's completely no holds barred. If abandonware video games were allowed to enter the public domain the moment the publisher decided to stop support, they would at least have a chance to continue living on through derived works created by others, openly and passionately shared among fans and hosted on any file sharing site or sold on any storefront. And they wouldn't have to be fearful of any litigation. That sounds like it would be a pretty good time. But the question is, why aren't these abandoned games on the public domain? Well, the answer was more or less already given a minute ago. Just because they're abandoned doesn't mean their copyright protections have expired. So when will they expire? Sadly, this is where the conversation becomes rather irritating and requires some context, specifically surrounding America's copyright law history. So let's start at the very beginning, in the year 1790, which is when the first Federal Copyright Act was instituted. It allowed creative works to be protected for 14 years, with the option of one renewal for an additional 14 years after that, adding up to 28 years total. The next Copyright Act was in 1831, which made the initial copyright term 28 years now, with an option for a 14-year renewal on top of that, making the new total 42 years. The next major Copyright Act was in 1909, which changed the renewal length from 14 years to 28 as well, so the new total was 56 years. The next big Copyright Act after that was in 1976, which changed the copyright term to a static 75-year length. In the case of creative works made by a single or small group of collaborating authors, however, the copyright term was until the death of the author or the last living author, plus 50 more years after that. As you can see, copyright term length has been historically pretty meaningless, because every time major companies realize the end of their copyright protection is just around the corner, they lobby to have it extended, and also to ensure that their future works are protected for longer. But the most egregious Copyright Act was the most recent one, in 1998. It was derogatorily called the Mickey Mouse Protection Act, because the Walt Disney Company realized their ownership of the Steamboat Willie version of Mickey Mouse was coming to an end in 2003, and they fought tooth and nail to prevent that from happening. To gather up favor, Disney CEO at the time, Michael Eisner, and other executives contributed $94,054 to Democratic members of Congress, and $62,932 to Republican members of Congress. Adjusting for inflation, that's about $180,000 and $120,000 today, respectively. Obviously, the act passed, and now Disney properties, along with every piece of media created by corporate authorship since 1964, was under copyright for 95 years, all because Disney wanted to maintain an iron grip around their mouse, and all it cost them was a handful of chump change. The first commercial video game console was the Magnavox Odyssey, which launched in September 1972. That means that any of its games that aren't already placed in the public domain manually won't be there until at least 2067. I genuinely do not know if I'll live long enough to see that. And I wasn't even born until almost 20 years after the Odyssey's release anyway. 95 years is a long time. It's long enough to ensure that most fans of any given game will be long dead before they see it added to the public domain. Not only that, but it's also more than long enough for the company who owned it to dissolve and cease to exist anyway, meaning they likely can't officially release the game into public domain themselves. If you don't own the copyright to something abandoned, then you cannot claim that it is abandoned, no matter how obvious it is. And you can't start making money off your own modified version as if it were in the public domain, because even if the copyright owner technically doesn't exist anymore, you can still get in big legal trouble. This is the part where piracy comes in. It's how people get their hands on games that will never see the light of day for any number of unfortunate reasons, usually licensing issues. I absolutely condone piracy for games that aren't being sold in stores or on digital storefronts anymore. Because if you don't pirate them, then buying secondhand copies is the only alternative. But there's fewer of those each day, and the remaining ones might get more and more expensive. But sadly, even piracy doesn't address every problem. One of the biggest misconceptions about PC gaming is that no matter how old the game is, it'll still run on your current rig no problem. But that's simply not true. Some games are so old they have no idea how to read your modern-day hardware. For a game released in 1994, your RTX 4090 might as well be alien technology not of this earth. Thankfully, compatibility is growing thanks to applications like DOSBox or making a virtual machine. But even then, the game might still not run as well as it would on the actual hardware of the time. This compatibility issue doesn't stop at just games either. There are schools, science institutions, and even hospitals out there that are using old computers with vulnerable old operating systems because some extremely critical part of their infrastructure runs on an old program that hasn't been updated in years or even decades. I can only imagine how many professional settings around the world are still dependent on Windows XP. There are still places out there hiring people who know COBOL and Fortran, programming languages made in the 1950s. It's possible to reverse engineer some of this old code and translate it to something modern, but it can cost tens to hundreds of thousands of dollars to achieve that. Much of data preservation in general is a total shit show, and copyright gets in the way. Going back to video games for a moment, I just want to say that as much as I stand by piracy, I must also admit that I would be perfectly fine with legally buying ROMs of my favorite games. I'm talking about the actual 2 megabyte file of Bahamut Lagoon for the SNES. If Square put that on Steam or something for $5, DRM free, just the honest-to-God ROM for everyone to officially have with no legal gray area to worry about, I would buy it. I'd be totally fine with buying ROMs that work with any emulator released directly from the publisher for $5 a pop. And I know plenty of other people would be cool with that too. And then there's online games that get unceremoniously unplugged. But in some cases, the population isn't even that barren when the time comes to shut everything down, abruptly ruining the investment of hundreds or thousands of playtime hours for hundreds of active players. There are instances where the community takes it upon themselves to continue the game with private servers, and the publisher mercifully turns a blind eye. But they could still step in and put a stop to it whenever they please. Unfortunately, a lot of games cannot run on private community servers because the publisher hoards the source code despite doing nothing with it, or due to the game's infrastructure being too big and expensive for a group of fans to reasonably maintain themselves. It's so crazy when I see a company stomp their feet about piracy of a specific product that they're not even selling anymore. Nintendo is the worst with this. They even went so far as to attempt to get all scans of all Nintendo Power issues taken off of Internet Archive, even though they don't offer any way of reading these issues themselves. If Nintendo had their own public Nintendo Power archive, then the request for removal would at least be understandable. But they don't have any such thing. How far do removal attempts like this have to go before the company is no longer just protecting their trademark and are now just actively destroying their history? None of this litigious nonsense would be something to worry about if the abandonment or ending of a product or service meant instant entry into the public domain. This way, companies would have to choose between putting more effort into keeping a property active themselves or letting the people do it for them, at the cost of making money off it. We don't need a 95-year wait for that transfer to happen. So what's the solution to all this? Well, the first point I've already made is to make abandonment an automatic release into public domain. If a company takes a product off shelves, physical and digital, with no intention to put it back up within a certain amount of time, then they've functionally abandoned it, and it should be forked over to the people. The next solution is to shorten copyright terms again. I honestly think 30 years is generous enough. If you release a product that sees active sales for 30 years, you should hopefully be made rich by the time those 30 years are over. If the product doesn't sell very well despite staying available for the whole term, then what additional harm could releasing it to the public domain possibly do that hasn't happened already? 30 years is more than enough time to milk a product and get the most out of it. Thirdly, and this is the most difficult one by far, I think everyone in general would benefit in the long term if we slowly learned to depend more on open source software and technology, and less on proprietary stuff, especially if usage and maintenance requires increasingly obscure knowledge. I know that's easier said than done, especially when proprietary software is often developed and updated faster thanks to the fact that it's proprietary. But I think as long as we at least address abandonment and long copyright terms, the situation will be significantly better. If you've been following my channel for a while, then you know I have a lot to say about this topic and everything related to it. And I'm sure I'll think of more to say in the future. But for now, this concludes my thoughts on Abandonware. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you around.